So then we move to outputs. And this is a really important part. So if you imagine that this starting point could be an epic, or it could be a story that hasn't been unpacked, or it could be any of the things I said earlier, this is where we're now starting to break down this thing to start our journey, figuring out how to get started in terms of what a solution might look like. And outputs are really important. So if you know anything about systems thinking, which has been around since the 1930s, the 1940s, there's a few rules that come out of that. One of them is that the value of a system lies in its outputs. So of course we've started with the outcome, so we're not losing sight of that, but the value of the system in terms of achieving those outcomes lies in the outputs. And so when we start to think about the outputs and brainstorm them, we start to get very quickly a coherent view of what's needed and what that looks like, what the work could be. Outputs are the things that you can see and touch. They might not be physical things, they might be a value getting updated on a database. It's the expected result, it's the thing, and that's where the value is. For example, if you were thinking about the complexity of an ATM and putting in place a system where you're trying to get money out, what that looks like and all the potential complexity, the outputs would be money, your card coming out of the machine, a change in a bank balance after you've interacted with it. They might be an error message. All of these things you can touch. And when you start to list them out, you can start to see what is needed in a system. Each of these layers of OOPSI is an opportunity to prioritize. So you've started with your outcome. When you brainstorm the outputs, you can see the ones that are important that you might want to get started with. And it might depend what you're doing, which ones you would choose. For example, in that illustration I just gave, getting the money is pretty important. And the update to the bank account being correct is pretty important. But all of the different error messages you could ever get, and all of the different types of screen interaction stuff that it might show you along the way, they're less important. So it allows you to focus. And then you start to talk about the outputs and you illustrate them. So this is a really important part of it. You don't illustrate all of them, but you illustrate the important ones. I'll get more into that, into process patterns. But what happens with outputs is when you start exploring them and examining them, you find that everything that you see on the outputs is part of your data model. A receipt from an ATM would include the amount and the currency and the transaction ID and all of those things. And so this starts to become really important in terms of what your system needs to be able to deliver. So if you're doing this collaboratively, this is hard to do without an example in front of you. If you're doing this collaboratively, you can imagine that if you're discussing outputs and you've got an architect and you've got a database engineer and you've got a business analyst and a business expert, the level of shared understanding that you're getting about the space that you're looking at is raising really fast. So I know I keep starting again. So start with the outcomes, then you explore the outputs, you look for the most important outputs, and then you collaborate on them and you illustrate them and try and make them concrete. So one of the anti-patterns that we have that I see is that we abstract all the time. When we're mocking something up, we'll put false data in it to make it like Mr. Hurty Knee or something like that. We'll put false data in there because we don't want to think about what the real data would be. And so if I was illustrating, for example, put an important output, which was a pay slip, and we were saying, okay, let's see if we can generate a pay slip. Let's talk about what that pay slip would look like. We'd be trying to accurately put on what is a payroll number? What's a real one? What's a national insurance code? What's a real one? We'd be wanting to make it really concrete. And so once you've decided on maybe a handful of outputs which you consider to be really important, and you're deciding, let's explore those and let's look at what we'd need to design in order to generate those outputs, that small selection from the big what could be, Then we move on to process. So then we can